Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the call today. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points. When joining the internet link, you will have been given the option of joining for your computer's audio or dialing in via the telephone. If you have difficulty connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies, (host), using the chat box. On a PC or laptop, the chat box is to the right-hand side. If using a phone or tablet, you will have to toggle the view to see this. To manage the session, this is all one-way audio. All participants are currently muted. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the question and answer box. If you're using a PC or laptop, the Q&A button is in the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're using a smartphone or tablet, again, you may have to toggle this. So please have a quick look now. Please use the opportunity to ensure that the slides are visible and minimize any features such as participant videos which you may find distracting. I should also note, this presentation will use polls. All polls are anonymous, so please do not worry about your answer when voting. Today's session is called Security Leadership, Management and Governance in Nuclear Security Culture. It is planned to last for about 45 minutes, with questions and answers at the end. This session is being recorded and will be available for download after the session. At the end of the session, there will be a short questionnaire for your feedback. This is useful for us to see, firstly, if you like the format of today's session, or if you have any recommendations on the format. Secondly, if you have any topics you would like to be covered, or have projects you would like to share with the community, please use the form to let us know. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to announce we are joined by Mr. George Foster for this session. George is currently the Director of Amport Risk Limited, which offers consultancy on nuclear security issues, and was previously the Managing Director of Security at Babcock International Group, and the first Director of Security at the Doel nuclear site in Scotland. George, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Carl, and welcome to all the viewers from around the world, for whom I'd like to say welcome back to the KCL Nuclear Security Culture Programme. It's good to note some familiar names on the attendee list. Before I crack on with the topic of this webinar, I'd just like to say there are slides, and of course there's information on the slides. There's no requirement for you to read the detail on the slides, but I would advise you to scan it, and that's because I'll be discussing the content of the slides as I go through the webinar. So let's move on to the topic. Security leadership, management and governance in nuclear security culture touches upon a number of topics that I've long held an interest in. Leadership is distinct from management, but they are often spoken of interchangeably in the same breath. The role of governance as distinct from leadership and management is also often misunderstood. All three elements have an important role to play in the build and maintenance of security culture in any sector or business. But I hope to be able to justify my belief that without good leadership, there will never be a scenario in which a strong and positive security culture will thrive. As such, what follows represents my own views forged through decades of occupying leadership positions and now interpreted in the context of nuclear security and nuclear security culture. Next slide, please. So for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to give a personal interpretation of why leadership matters. I'll draw the distinction between leadership, management and governance before looking at how this fits into the International Atomic Energy Authority's view of nuclear security culture and the UK perspective on this. I'll round this off by drawing from the case study of the anti-nuclear demonstrators' incursion of July 2012 into the Y-12 National Security Complex in Tennessee, the USA. Next slide, please. Leadership matters. We'll come to that. But so does meaning. Leadership, management and governance convey meaning, and it's important to any balanced understanding that meaning in language is understood. So here I offer some definitions which identify leadership as a relationship. Identify leadership as a relationship of many different colors between those that lead and those that are led. That is, the followers. Whilst leadership doesn't necessarily infer that leaders have to be at the front, the concept of being at the front is entirely appropriate in terms of the emotional bond that exists between leaders and followers. Leading relates to influence. This doesn't necessarily tie itself to some form of appointed or assumed authority and status. This can certainly help, but leaders ultimately display leadership by achieving a status of powerful influence over followers. This is not to say that followers occupy some subservient status to leaders. This is not so, as many of us will know from the way in which more junior managers and leaders can influence their peer group and superiors outside the framework of a hierarchical structure. A leader's influence can be demonstrated most powerfully through motivation and inspiration. Leaders motivate and inspire followers because followers believe in the direction that competent and respected leaders set. So ultimately, leadership might be something which is said to be felt and experienced. Management, on the other hand, is not driven by an emotional relationship, but by the doing aspect. Management is a description of a function that seeks to follow, to drive, to coordinate, to enforce activity related to processes, procedures, and programs through the authority provided to managers. This authority is not an emotional link, but has embedded itself in other processes of reward, incentivization, and sanction, for example. Governance is the means by which senior leaders set the strategic direction of a nuclear licensee's commercial operations. A governing body acts as the most senior organizational body responsible for decision-making over matters that govern the business and its security. So in a nuclear organization, this might be represented at two levels. At the higher level, this would be the board of directors, known as the board or the executive board, where a board member should hold ultimate responsibility for security. And at a lower level, perhaps a security committee, which holds delegated authority and responsibility for setting detailed security objectives and direction. Ultimately, though, governance by leaders doesn't assume effective leadership. But an easy way in which to view the distinction between managers and leaders might be the quote from Warren Bennis: "The manager has his eye on the bottom line, that is profit, through the application of processes, procedures, and programs, whilst the leader has his eye on the horizon to set the strategic direction and financial and operational objectives of the organization." Now, I've mentioned leaders and followers. This doesn't assume that any one of us is constrained to being identified as a leader or a follower. Next slide, please. At different levels and with differing responsibilities, or even outside these formal frameworks, leaders will be followers in the same way that followers may also be leaders in differing settings. The context is what will determine the tag of a leader or a follower. Within structured hierarchical organizations, such as nuclear licensees, which depend on their commercial success by following and complying with protocols and regulatory expectations, leaders should be selected for their proven potential to lead. Now, it's not that simple, and many of you will know or identify managers who you believe have been promoted to senior leadership positions by way of graduated time served when they've already reached their ceiling of performance and potential, rather than achieving that position through a focused leadership selection process, which identifies not just past performers, but specific leadership traits and potential. This is one area where a failure in leadership leads to those followers, so-called subordinates, withdrawing their permission to follow, and friction and fragmentation occurs in an organization, impacting on organizational culture, and specifically in our case, security culture. But we'll address this link shortly. Authority, responsibility, and accountability are three terms around which the whole set of leadership and managerial activities cluster. These terms are interrelated, but at the same time they're misunderstood in their relationship to leadership and management. But they are the basic premise of the process of managing and leading. Authority is the right to command action by others and to enforce compliance conferred by an official appointment. In this way, authority is exercised by, for example, decision-making, direction, persuasion, sanctions, and even constraint or coercion. Responsibility denotes an obligation of an individual to do his or her assigned job satisfactorily to the best of their ability. However, responsibility should always be results-orientated, so far as management is concerned, in order to hold people accountable. Authority denotes the granting of power. Responsibility points to the satisfactory completion of directed tasks, and accountability refers to the liability regarding those tasks. Authority can be delegated. Responsibility can be shared but cannot be delegated. But accountability can neither be shared nor delegated. Being held accountable means having to answer about the results associated with responsibility and conduct. These themes are the basic building blocks of what management and leadership involves. However, authority, responsibility, and accountability are exercised, and how that's done is about leadership. This is the aspect of an emotional relationship between leaders and followers which I mentioned previously. It can be completely smooth and frictionless with the best results, or it can be corrosive, disruptive, and coercive, with results which are fragile and less likely to be enduring. This indicates how leadership is connected to culture and positive organizational results and outcomes. It is because leadership is about vision, change, motivation, inspiration, and strategic direction that leadership of all aspects of human behavior in an organization shapes the character and behavior of the organization itself. The character and behavior of an organization, as we know and will see, is what defines the culture of the organization. It is so, therefore, that the leadership of nuclear security, as in any aspect of leadership, will define the strength and durability of nuclear security culture. This is why good and effective nuclear security leadership is likely to generate a strong nuclear security culture, which itself should be expected to achieve higher levels of nuclear security assurance and confidence in security arrangements. Next slide, please. Leadership also matters because it is what shapes and drives corporate strategy and objectives. As I mentioned earlier, it may be a security governance structure that will create these and pursue them through the setting of targets. This is as equally applicable to nuclear security as it is to any other business function. What is different to other business functions is that nuclear security is very expensive and often seen as a necessary but unwelcome cost which plays upon and reduces profit. This is where nuclear security leaders need to change their language and narrative to reflect what good nuclear security can do as a business enabler that delivers value in the sense of commercial worth rather than cost, which is perceived in a discretionary and discountable way. Part of repositioning nuclear security through its leadership is to align security goals and objectives with commercial, legal, and regulatory expectations. This enables good security to be measured as a contributing element to these commercial objectives, if only through the avoidance of unnecessary and unbudgeted cost, which can be associated with security failure. The fact is that the cost of nuclear security is high because the consequences of failure can be so great and catastrophic. Low-risk perceptions prevail because of this, and they drive the cost equation. Nuclear security leadership must achieve security arrangements which are appropriate to the regulatory requirement, proportionate to the threat and the categorization of nuclear material, and affordable to the business. This element of risk-managed affordability creates value if it's properly implemented by achieving more with the same or with less resource. It will be clear that the value of nuclear security will be enhanced whilst cost is controlled if nuclear security culture is shaped by effective leadership. This is the human dimension in achieving an effective security culture. The absence of this will result in security compromise, which will undermine commercial objectives and will impact on the business in any of a multitude of different aspects depicted on this slide. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to address the detail in this slide, and there is no need to read the detail in the blue text boxes. But I ask you to focus on the categorization of risks in the center, which a business can carry, and interpret how these may be seen in your own area of employment. So that is looking at the reputational risks, the financial risks, the operational risks, the compliance risks, and the strategic risks. And so we'll now move to our first polling question. First poll, please. And the question is, in which risk category do you think the greatest security risk lies? Pick one. We'll take about 30 seconds, pardon me, 30 seconds or a minute to see what the scores on the doors look like. And we've got 10 out of 27 voted so far. Well done. We're nearly halfway. 48% voted so far. I'll give you 15 more seconds to think about that. There have clearly been a few people who have attended our presentations at the fundamental security workshops, but they seem to be getting somewhere near what I think is probably a reasonable answer. 22 out of 27. Is there anybody else who'd like to vote? I'm closing in 5 seconds. We'll end the polling now. Thank you. And the polling shows that 50% of the respondents have voted that operational is the greatest area of security risk. And my view would be I'd have to agree, because I think it's in the operational area where an initiating event of malicious origin can occur, and which can then have a consequential and catalytic impact on those other areas of security risk. It's within the security system and the compromise of the security system where the greatest risk lies, and that is what leads to impact in those other areas. So thank you for that, and we'll move on. So as I said, of these categories, it is arguably the area of operational risk which carries the greatest catalytic impact, because it is in the operational arena of a nuclear business that an initiating event might lead to a security event or a security incident, either of which itself may have an impact in any or all of the other risk categories. Next slide, please. So, for example, this table refines the presentation of impact specific to the consequence of a security initiating event. I'll give you a few moments just to scan that slide. Next slide, please. The sabotage of a steam turbine hydraulic oil slump at the Doel nuclear power plant in northern Belgium in August 2014 shut down the Doel 4 reactor for 4 months. This created an unforeseen and unbudgeted consequential direct cost of approximately 160 million euros. The indirect costs associated with, for example, contractual obligations to the supply chain, loss of confidence from investors and the Belgian state and international bodies, and others related to strategic, financial and reputational risk categories is not calculated. But you can imagine they will have been considerable. It must be clear that any assessment of the reasons for the failure of security measures and security culture to prevent this insider sabotage can be attributed at some level to a weak security culture and ineffective security and executive leadership. This discussion brings me to the place of nuclear security culture and its place in the nuclear enterprise. Next slide, please. The IAEA definition of nuclear security culture is shown. Despite what the IAEA definition states, an organization or institution doesn't intrinsically have characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors. These are human factors, which are illustrated through the relationship between those aspects of how security culture arrangements are followed and implemented, in essence a management function, and how they are directed and led, a leadership function. Leadership should direct, guide, motivate, and ensure the application of security culture management arrangements. Thus, poorly led security management results in a poor security culture. This is the manner in which organizations take on the culture, that is the characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors of their leadership. This illustrates directly the connection between leadership and security culture. Properly led organizations and the operational functions in them such as nuclear security, create a powerful framework in which to operate and reduce enterprise risk across many risk areas which are within the control of the organization. This is as applicable to nuclear security as it is to nuclear safety. This is because good operational culture acts as the single most powerful unifying force in an organization. It acts as an influential multiplier in achieving effective nuclear security culture, where the unifying effect of common effort ensures that the characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors seen across the whole organization are greater when unified than if there was an absence of shared purpose and direction. Next slide, please. The IAEA model of security culture outlines in excess of 30 characteristics that define or contribute to a strong nuclear security culture. To be effective, a strong security culture requires a unified approach to security culture across diverse disciplines and functions in a nuclear license holder. This is achieved by leadership focus on these 30+ characteristics, which emphasizes how well-constructed management systems complement behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes through the guidance brought about by leadership. We're now going to go to our next polling question. The next polling question, please. And the question is, which aspect of leadership influence is most critical in building and maintaining security culture? Is it leader characteristics, leader attitudes, leader behavior, or all of these? I'm asking for the most critical. Well, I was hoping somebody would come in with something else other than all of these. We're 64% through the participant responses, thank you. And we'll close the vote in 10 seconds with 6 votes to go. Okay, so 73% have answered all of these, 14% each have answered leader attitude and leader behavior. Well, it wasn't designed to be a trick question. And I did ask for which aspect is the most critical. And I don't think anybody would blame anybody for answering all of them. I think they're all important and all critical. But if one had to choose one of them, my view would be that leader behaviors is the most important. And that's because behaviors is about the way one acts. It's the visible illustration of one's attitudes and one's characteristics. It's not always easy to know one's attitudes. They're unseen. And characteristics tend to take time coming out in terms of relationships and behavior. But behavior is one thing which is absolutely visible to everybody. And if I think I was asked, having been pinned down to define or determine which was the most critical, I think I would go for leader behavior. But I don't think any of the answers are wrong. They're all, of course, key, important influences on nuclear security culture. The greatest influences on the individual's contribution to nuclear security culture are the expectations, commitment, and demonstration of leaders, supported by the implementation of management processes, procedures, and programs through an effective management system. This is why the IAEA 3-tier security culture model places such an emphasis on the security management system. The security management system encompasses the totality of security documentation, which specifies what staff should do, how they should behave, and their roles and responsibilities in supporting security culture. We'll come back to this 3-tier model when we look at the next case study. The IAEA implementing guidance on nuclear security culture, incorporating the role of security leadership and management, is reflected in the UK's approach to security leadership, governance, and management. Next slide, please. The UK approach is stated in the UK Nuclear Regulators Security Assessment Principles, which were published in April 2017, and which provide guidance to regulatory inspectors, which is also taken as guidance for compliance by license holders. The importance of leadership, governance, and management, and its indivisible link with nuclear security culture, is reflected in the priority given to these issues in the UK guidance. Leadership and management for security is presented as the first and most important fundamental security principle, and the place of an organisational culture that promotes the importance of security is presented as the second fundamental security principle. This UK regulatory guidance expects security leaders to use effective, efficient and dynamic management systems to engender strong, positive security culture and work processes which drive continually improving security and business performance, whilst demonstrating ongoing compliance. Duty holders best achieve this level of expectation by implementing an integrated management system that ensures that security is considered in all operational activities, rather than confined purely to the security system. A capable organisation is expected to implement and maintain the security of its undertakings. This requires leadership across the organisation, from its senior governance board to every level in the management structure. This assumes that leadership has set the objectives of the nuclear enterprise to allow management processes to determine the skill sets, the staff levels and resources required to enable the management of nuclear security in the enterprise. Effective decision makers should be able to demonstrate that they can make balanced, rational decisions on account of their leadership ability, their qualifications and experience, and which take into account the nuclear security risks, the likely impact of operational decisions, and the needs of the business. Unqualified, inexperienced, or temperamentally unsuitable personnel should not be in roles where significant mission or time-related security decisions are required. Inexperienced leaders in this position should be supported through a structured program of leadership and decision-making training or mentoring. This is an example of how potential leaders can grow through personal development. This growth in leadership ability and depth through an organisation can be driven by organisational learning. Organisational learning is an engine that drives improvement and is as relevant in nuclear security as it is in all business areas. It is significantly influenced by the working environment and the culture in the nuclear organisation. This culture is set, as we've heard, by the leadership of the organisation, by setting expectations, by leading by commitment, and doing and driving learning opportunities, realising these opportunities by driving change and by recognising and rewarding improvement. Leadership should also demand evidence of security performance. The most effective way to do this is through an independent assurance function, which sits outside the operational security management function. This assurance function should be focused on providing evidence to senior leadership, for example, at the level of the security committee or the executive board, that security risks are being controlled in an appropriate, proportionate and affordable manner. Such independent information underpins a senior leader's ability to set the direction of the security effort and to manage change when it is required. Now, it should be notable that in the UK, nuclear security regulation expects a nuclear licensee board to give priority to the development and maintenance of security culture as part of its business objectives. Key to delivering this is that each level of the organisation knows the roles, responsibilities and accountabilities for security. And I've mentioned already that these are the key aspects of the building blocks of management and leadership. But leadership is about how these building blocks are conducted. Thus, nuclear security leaders can have a significant influence in supporting security culture through their behaviour by demonstrating their commitment to nuclear security. This again emphasises the criticality of leadership in delivering good nuclear security culture, supported and dependent upon a strong nuclear security culture itself. Leaders are critical to a successful management function and a business itself. But where do they come from? Next slide, please. Are they born or are they made? There are many cartoons and worthy comments about leadership, and I'll show you one or two in the next slide. For example, the great man theory of leadership presented in the mid-19th century, when global history was shaped by male leaders in positions of great influence, assumed that great leaders were somehow born with the characteristics and traits of leadership. There are obvious flaws in the great man theory, Primarily, it is absurd to suggest that leadership is bestowed upon men only. It will be self-evident that social constraints restricted opportunity for women to act as and develop as leaders, and it is abundantly clear that women can lead as well as men, and the sex of a person is not the determinant of leadership potential. Of course, if leadership was simply an inborn quality, then all people who possess the necessary traits would eventually find themselves in leadership roles, regardless of whether they were women or men. This is clearly not so, but it does represent a theory which can still be seen around the world in practice. But the one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that leaders are not born. So for those of you who have children, as do I hope there were no shouts of congratulations in the delivery room. Leaders are, however, in my view, a product of their background, their environment, and the opportunity bestowed on them. That is not to say that all people in the most advantageous position will be leaders, far from it. Leaders must want to lead. Without commitment, leadership will not occur, and it is this human factor which will dominate those who choose to lead wholeheartedly, and those who choose not to or cannot. Without this commitment to an aim, a vision, or a purpose, for example, leaders will always run the risk of falling short on outcomes, as followers withdraw their support from their leaders, regardless of whether their leadership authority is derived from respected liberal authority or authoritarian coercive leadership. Leadership is a complex area of study and knowledge. Next slide, please. This much will probably be clear by now. Now, whilst I'm showing just a sample of styles, types, and theories here, these aren't accepted as being exclusive or necessarily authoritative. There are as many as you would like to pick. Some of them will seem familiar to you, and you will know or have experienced leaders or bosses who fit the styles and types. You may be less aware of the theories shown here. I mentioned the great man theory. Some of these, such as that theory, the trait theory and behavioural theory, are based on the leaders are born not made premise. Others, such as the transactional, situational and participative theories, are based upon the context and the balance of factors that shape any actions designed to influence others. Next slide, please. But whatever your thoughts on the theoretical aspects of the study of leadership, leaders will display some or many of these traits or behavioural characteristics. These alone don't make them leaders. Many others will display these traits and behaviours, but to a less successful degree. After all, when people are considered great leaders, it's normally considered in the past tense. It's less common that any of us could accurately determine which people will develop rather than grow into good leaders. What distinguishes these groups is the way in which these traits are deployed and the balance between them in any given context. Context changes and successful leaders know this, and they adjust to it. Over time, gaining experience and with personal development, leaders can become more able through their ability to place the challenge they face in the context of their database of experience. Next slide, please. So how do you see leadership in your organization? Which of these people silhouetted against the mountain sky is leading? Is the person celebrating the summit leading? Or is the person in the middle of the human chain with direct engagement with the summit team leading? Or is the person with binoculars directing the climb from another peak leading? Excuse me. None of these is invalid, I think. Is there really a distinction between the boss who barks from the back of the team and the leader who pulls the team with him or her? Is the boss an autocratic authoritarian leader? In my military career, the term boss was a term of respect which was not offered easily. And I remember the first time some of my subordinates used the phrase. It meant something more than barking orders, and it was understood to be a soft and more casual form of respect conveyed on leaders who had earned it. My point here is that followers will only follow leaders when those leaders have demonstrated and earned their privilege of leading. Leaders are change agents. This is because they're on a journey to change something, to achieve the best outcomes for the organization or the people they have responsibilities for. This is why leaders set the direction, they demonstrate commitment to moving in that direction, and they continually review and refresh the performance of the organization in that journey. When change doesn't occur, as you see in two examples in the bottom corners of the slide, inertia sets in and business suffers. In a nuclear security environment, this can mean complacency about the performance of security arrangements, an absence of continual improvement and learning from experience, and a weakening nuclear security culture. These are all factors that can act as a catalyst to security compromise. Next slide, please. On July the 28th, 2012, an 83-year-old Catholic nun and two of her fellow peace activists broke into the Y-12 National Security Complex at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the USA. And during the course of moving around the complex, they sprayed graffiti on the walls of the highly enriched uranium manufacturing facility. You'll see that highlighted on the slide. Next slide, please. Y-12 is a vast complex of interlinked sites owned by the Department of Energy. It was administered by the National Nuclear Security Administration through a complex framework of commercial contracts. Security was provided by a complex contractual arrangement between at least 3 different commercial suppliers. And as you'll note, the annual budget for security was significant at $150 million. Next slide, please. During the early hours of the 28th of July, 2012, the intruders cut through 3 chain-link fences with basic cutting tools. They crossed through a number of alarmed areas and barriers with intruder detection systems installed and spray-painted biblical messages of non-violence on the HEUMF facility, which at that time housed an estimated 400 tons of highly enriched uranium, the radioactive material used to fuel nuclear weaponry. Next slide, please. When they reached the HEUMF building itself, having overcome its perimeter protection, they attempted to draw attention to themselves. When they weren't immediately detained, they spray painted the north wall of the building and they hammered on the base of the guard tower at the northwest corner of the building. They didn't attempt to gain entry into the building, and at no time did they achieve any further penetration. Next slide, please. In a 2011 NNSA performance evaluation, the facility's physical security system was graded as good. Whilst adequate, the fact that higher gradings of very good and excellent were possible showed some room for improvement. Much of this room for improvement rested in the area of unifying complex contractual relationships and expectations, which clouded the clarity of roles, responsibilities, and authorities and accountability for security at the site. Yet this was clearly an assessment where there was much good to be found in the security of the site. Following the breach, it is notable the stark contrast of language used to describe the impact of the incursion. Next slide, please. In the inevitable inquiries that followed, the purpose of which was to get under the skin of the site's leadership and management and to understand the detail of what went wrong, it is notable that the openness with which the US government went about this. This transparency in itself is an act of leadership to share knowledge whilst holding those responsible to be accountable, pardon me, to ensure that the lessons are learned. These reports, of which there are more than one, point to a historical hands-off federal, a history of hands-off federal oversight, neglecting security systems and their maintenance, complexity in contractual relationships and poor management oversight, all of which were factors that contributed to a systemic failure in security culture. The description of ineptitude on the slide doesn't relate to a management function. It relates to human behavior, and this is a key element of culture. Behavior as a human factor resides with leadership. So it should be no surprise that the NNSA described this episode as a failure of leadership, demanding swift, strong, and decisive action. Next slide, please. So the impact. Remediation of the security system cost $15 million in security improvements. $12 million was deducted from the management contractor's bonus fee. Of course, uncosted reputational damage was done to all tiers of management and leadership at the complex. And the fact that the US administration conducted so many inquiries into the incursion is an indication of the considerable reputational damage it felt. The guard who first responded to the incident was sacked, and other officials followed. No senior leaders were caught in the immediate fireball that followed the incident. That's a metaphorical fireball, of course. This incident, that had it been conducted with malicious and violent intent, could have had a completely different outcome when, as the evidence subsequently showed, security and security culture at the Y12 complex had been neglected. Perhaps it should come as no surprise that one US senator at one of the inquiry hearings thanked the nun involved, Sister Megan Rice, for highlighting the inadequacies of the security system at the Y12 complex. Next slide, please. Ultimately, in an immediate post-incident report, the US Department of Energy categorized the failure on the night of the 28th of July 2012 in these terms. I'll just ask you to reflect on these categories for a moment. Next slide, please. When these categories of failure are mapped to the IAEA security culture three-tier model, the cultural weaknesses fall broadly into the highlighted areas. My question to you is, on reflection, which of these elements of nuclear security culture do not depend upon good leadership to deliver an appropriate, proportionate, and affordable security system? I would suggest they all depend on good leadership. In concluding, the challenge in getting security leadership, management, and governance right rests primarily with leadership. Leadership sets the vision, the direction, the color, the tone, the culture in which governance sets and manages the high-level commercial objectives, and in which management applies the processes, procedures, and programs to deliver those objectives. All of this is enveloped by security culture. So the strongest nuclear security culture will be based upon leaders who can demonstrate and lead through their commitment to nuclear security and their adoption of a leadership philosophy based upon a clear statement of intent at all levels and using techniques such as delegation of responsibilities and authorities to the lowest reasonable level to generate high levels of trust and integrity, supported by managerial processes which enable measurable security success. And so wrapping up, let's move to our last poll. And there's no trick here. Just give you time to read it carefully. The question is, which are the critical functions of leadership and which determine security culture? Is it responsibility, autonomy, and accountability? Is it power, wealth, and corruption? Is it responsibility, authority, and accountability? Or is it none of these? So we're a third of the way through, thank you. And it's a fairly unambiguous lead here. And I'm pleased to say that might either reflect prior knowledge or reflect that attendees have been listening. There's a little bit of variation coming in at the end. We're 61% through, so please keep voting. We'll give you another 20 seconds. And 10 more seconds, we've got another 9 votes to go, please. Okay, and we'll close the polling there. And hopefully you can all see the results of the polling. Well, if one reflects on what I've been speaking about, yes, the answer would be responsibility, authority, and accountability, and that is conventionally what is considered to be the 3 key elements of the way in which leaders manage. So it's the 3 elements which are critical to the management function and the way in which leaders lead the management function. I'm not surprised that somebody, one answer has come in of power, wealth, and corruption, because it may well be in your own environments that that's where the critical function of leadership lies. And that reflects on some of the comments I made earlier about the ability of people to lead and whether they're bred or born, and how one achieves a leadership position. It is unfortunately a reality that some leaders in some cultures and some environments do gain leadership positions from power, wealth, and corruption. I might add that doesn't necessarily make them good leaders, and I'm sure some of you will share that view. But we'll close that poll now, and then I'll just wrap up. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, the next webinar in the KCL webinar series will be titled Nuclear Security During Transport, and will be presented by Ben Whittard, the Director of Safety, Security and the Environment at International Nuclear Services. This session will discuss the unique challenges associated with protecting nuclear and radioactive material from unauthorized removal and sabotage during transport. Further details on this session will be provided in due course, and inquiries can be made of Carl, whose details with mine are on the slide. So thank you for listening and taking part. Carl, back to you, and I'll see if I can answer any questions.
Thank you, George. That was very informative. Thank you for sharing your expertise there. Just a very quick reminder, for anyone listening, please do use the Q&A box if you have any questions or thoughts which George has generated. Although in the meantime, I'm just going to use the chair's prerogative. So, George, I think you mentioned a lot of commercial facilities in your presentation. And really, I'm just wondering whether or not you think the need and approach of leadership, whether there are common factors between the size of an organization. So, for example, going from a commercial nuclear power plant down to a research reactor or other type of research facility. Are there any qualities of leadership which are transferable? And I'm just going to use the second point, which comes from one of the questions asked, whether or not there are, how might nuclear security leadership differ from country to country as well? So between size of facility or between countries, are there common qualities that would work well in any context?
I think, well, I'll try and answer them both at the same time, if I may. I think leadership in smaller groups can be easier simply because there are fewer stakeholders involved, and there's likely to be fewer dependencies and tensions between those stakeholders. And larger organizations which have many, many other stakeholders, that can be more difficult. There are more tensions, more people to deal with, and at the end of the day, leadership is about having responsibility for so-called followers, subordinates, or whatever phrase one would like to use. And the more of those that there are, the more stakeholders there are, there do tend to be more challenges associated with that. I wouldn't say that that is an absolute answer, though, because I do think it depends on the context and the importance of the commercial environment which one is operating in. There can be some small organizations which have very, very sensitive responsibilities and commercial objectives, and the consequences of getting it wrong can be very significant, and that can bring with it equally leadership challenges. I'll just move on to the second part about countries. I think the principles of leadership are pretty well universal in my view. The way in which one can apply them, of course, is entirely dependent upon the context, something I said during the talk. And the context will be entirely different in different countries, in different cultures. And the ability for people to reach leadership positions or to grow as leaders or to apply leadership skills and techniques will be entirely different, but it will be shaped and it will be conditioned by the context in which they seek to work. And I'm under no illusion that certainly here in the UK, we're fortunate for the most part that we do have a culture which allows leadership to grow wherever the potential is seen for the most part. I wouldn't say it's universal, but it is different than in some countries where that is less easy and where the opportunity to grow as leaders is more constrained.
Thank you, George. I think on the question of leadership and qualities, I know you mentioned in the talk about the idea that it's not just great men, great women can do works as well. But women are typically underrepresented in the nuclear field, I think particularly at the leadership level. So I guess another two-part question. What would you advise to women or leaders in current sort of nuclear facilities? How can you advise women who would like to develop their leadership skills and seek out opportunities. So how can you improve that, I think? And then the second part would be, how important is diversity when it comes to nuclear security leaders? Should we be encouraging a wider range of leaders? I think in my experience, most community managers tend to come from military backgrounds.
Well, I think there are two parts to perhaps the same question. I think dealing with the second question first, I think the value of diversity should be known to everybody. It brings a greater knowledge base. It brings experience from different sectors and different environments and different cultures. And that in itself can open up solutions to challenges which otherwise would be considered to be very, very difficult. And I think, you know, I think nuclear security is beginning to understand this. We're beginning to see much more diverse nuclear security leaders come into the business to displace, as you say, some leaders who, for the most part, certainly in the UK and the US, come from military or police backgrounds and the like. I do think those people coming from military or police backgrounds can easily transition. Many of them are very successful doing so, but it doesn't necessarily tick the diversity box, and it doesn't really acknowledge the benefits that can come from diversity. I think bringing more women into nuclear security leadership is absolutely key, because, you know, men and women together bring a much broader base of experience, and we think differently. I'm not saying that men and women just think differently. All men and all women think differently, and that has great value as well, because it brings into it the challenge function, the positive challenge function, which can often lead to solutions which would not have otherwise have been considered. How do we train people like that? It is a challenge, I think, what we would call horizontal recruitment, that is bringing in other people into a senior position horizontally rather than growing them from the bottom. But I think people in leadership positions have to understand the benefit that diversity can bring and put in place personal development programs so that women in particular can go into those programs and can grow through those programs into positions of senior leadership, frankly, be it in any commercial operation or in a nuclear security operation.
No, thank you, George. I think the idea of growing staff internally is very important. I have a question here. So how can those, and it's a practical question, how can those at the working level in a nuclear enterprise influence leadership awareness for the need of nuclear security improvements?
So I've got the question here. How can those at the working level in nuclear enterprises influence leadership awareness? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. How?
I think it's one where if you're, and please comment on the Q&A if it's not the case, whoever asked this. I think if you're working in a nuclear enterprise and you're at the coalface, so to speak, if you see something which needs improving, are there practical ways which you can alert this to management or get it on the agenda in a more urgent way? Or
right, okay, I understand. Well, I think two things. In an organization which really values nuclear security culture, for example, or operational culture, there should be the managerial processes and programs which enable people to raise these issues. There are many programs that we have which are similar to these in the UK, which are often incentivized to encourage people to do so. And that should then be managed by somebody who has responsibility, and remember that issue about responsibility and accountability for looking at those suggestions and driving them forward to at least provide an answer. That is a sort of management mechanism. The aspect of how one can do that with one's leaders to increase awareness of nuclear security improvements and stuff is down to, the other side aspect of it is down to a relationship with one's managers, one's line managers and stuff like that. And that is down to, I think, interpersonal relationships. It's down to showing that you have value in the organization, that you are fulfilling your responsibilities, you're happy to be held accountable for your own delivery of those responsibilities. But if your leaders aren't listening, that is very, very difficult. It is very difficult. And I've had that question asked in one of the workshops before. And I don't think the answer is necessarily to circumvent one's line managers, for example, but it is an option, but it is a very dangerous option. what I would say is that it's just about being persistent without being critical or negative, to encourage one's leaders to understand the benefit of what you're saying to them, so they can understand how it improves their position and it improves their accountability.
No, thank you, George. Just for attendees, I only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to try and get the next couple of questions in, so we might run over a little bit, but I hope it's worth it. So thank you for bearing with us. George, one on insider threats. As we know, one threat can come from insiders. What are the responsibilities of leaders to address this, and are there any practical steps you think leaders can take to do this?
Yeah, I think the responsibility of the leaders to address insiders is first to recognise the problem, is to recognise the threat that they create and how critical that threat is. And the difficulty about insider threats is they're very, very difficult to bound, to determine, to define in an organisation, because for the most part you can't see them. You simply don't know who is that person who is under so much pressure from whatever means that they will conduct malicious activity as an insider. You'll remember, of course, that insiders are ones who have authorised access to commit unauthorised acts, and that's virtually the definition of an insider. But what do leaders do? Well, first of all, they ensure that there is a vetting process in place before people are employed, and that vetting process is a thorough process. That is normally a national requirement, and it's normally a national responsibility to deliver that. I would also advocate that there is further vetting within the organisation itself, where it does its own internal vetting. But I think beyond that, it's about induction. It's about ensuring that when people are coming in, that they know what their responsibilities are for security and for advocating and promoting security culture. But then it's all about relationships. It's about leaders knowing their people. And it's about line managers and managers knowing their people. It's not just assuming that once they're employed, they're good. It's about knowing what makes them move and what makes them think and what triggers them. It's about knowing whether they've got financial difficulties at home. It's about knowing whether they've got domestic difficulties about home. It's about knowing something about their home and their domestic lives, so that one can be engaged with them. That is not Big Brother. That is simply a responsibility of leaders, is to know the people they're leading, so that they can identify possible triggers, possible red flags, and deal with those red flags, in a way which is empathetic, and because that's what leaders should be displaying before those red flags become critical issues and insider threats or insider attacks are conducted.
No, thank you, George. I think it's a great opportunity, to display leadership and to show drive culture in your organisation as well. I'm just going to try and wrap up the last two questions. So I'm sorry if you have asked a question and we don't get to answer it. But really, I think it's one of particularly maybe in the developing economies, developing societies. I'm going to put two questions together. One, so the process in which leaders emerge in the nuclear security sector is critical. Do you have a comment on the way forward in perhaps which developing societies can help foster the emergence of competent leaders? And related to that is one where, do you think on a practical level, nuclear security, the impact, poor nuclear security can impact a developing country which is seeking to develop a nuclear power program? So, for example, how can these be framed, or how can these be pursued in a country which is still seeking nuclear power, or which is seeking nuclear power?
I think the first question about, which I think was about, in fact, sorry, I apologise. Just remind me the first question.
So in developing economies, developing nuclear economies,
yeah,
do you have a comment on the way forward in which they can help foster the emergence of competent leaders?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that the leaders in a position of influence on a senior level need to first recognise that they have a challenge there, and perhaps that they need some help. And then the best thing, in my view, would be demonstrably to reach out for that help and bring that help in and try and address it at every level of the organisation. And I mean from that perspective, from a state level down to a commercial organisational level. Leadership doesn't grow from the bottom up organically. It can do, but it will come to a point where it simply can't go any further. It's the same way that security culture won't grow organically from the bottom up. It's got to be led from the top because that direction and guidance, that journey has got to be articulated at the top. So it's got to be recognised in organisational terms at the board level, at the executive level, that that leadership is something that requires enhancement or requires assistance or requires teaching and developing. And that requires, I think, a leadership program to be put in place. And countries and organisations which don't have that internally need to reach out to other organisations or other countries for assistance in doing that. And that is the best way to grow it. It's the best way of work as well in which to exchange knowledge and information about how one does that. And one aspect of that, of course, is making sure that people go through a development program which trains them as leaders. When I started in my military career, I don't suppose I was ever thought to be a leader. But having been trained in it through many, many years and then thrown into some very difficult environments where you either lead or you don't, you lead or you fail, you pretty quickly learn how to swim. And sometimes that's not particularly comfortable, but it is nevertheless the way in which leaders grow. So I think support from the top, advocacy from the top, putting in place leadership programs, bringing in help from either other commercial organizations or other states, other nations to assist in that, and make sure it's a long-term enduring relationship, because changes to leadership and the balance of leadership in organizations or in specific sectors doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time.
Thank you, George. I'm just going to do a quick plug there on some of the research which is going on at CSSS at the moment. We're currently writing some case studies on how organisations have fostered good nuclear security culture, and I think those are applicable across all levels there. And I guess just very quickly to address the second part of that question is there a way of framing good security culture in the light of an emerging nuclear power program? Like, how can you emphasize that, or how could you sell that effectively to higher ups?
I think it comes to something I spoke about during the presentation. It's about understanding the value that nuclear security culture can bring, and a lot of it is about offsetting the costs of getting it wrong to a certain extent. But it's also about understanding the commercial value of good security culture as something which distinguishes one organization from another. If one organization has demonstrably got a good security culture because it's been assessed as so by the regulator, that organization will benefit from less regulatory intervention, less regulatory interest. It will be able to focus on its commercial objectives far more than focusing on compliance issues with the regulator. And it will be in a better position commercially, economically, and in terms of finance, probably in terms of its revenue and profit, than an organization which is spending its time dealing with security issues because it's getting too many minor security compromises, which is bringing it regulatory attention, which is introducing additional cost as well. But that only starts from the top. And I'll give you an example. The first post I went into as the Director of Security at Doel in Scotland. I was the first Director of Security there. I was brought into that post. I mean, whoever would have won the post would have been brought into it, but it happened to be me, brought into that post to relieve the Managing Director of the focus he was having to provide on security, because it was displacing him and the focus he needed to place on other commercial activities. And within 5 months, I was invited onto the board of the organization. And the reason for that is because they wanted to promote nuclear security culture at the highest level of leadership in the organization. And that demonstrated that the leaders at the highest level backed and advocated security leadership. So again, it comes back to that fact that it's got to be a demonstrable commitment for that security culture to develop through an organization. And that demonstrable commitment needs to be enduring as well. It's not something which is done for a 3-month program or 6-month program and then forgotten about. the point about culture is it's something that pervades our lives. And in this sense, it's something that pervades our commercial responsibilities.
No, thank you, George. I think that's a good sentiment to end on. So thank you everyone for attending and for your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get the chance to answer them. But hopefully that those will have been covered during the presentation. Just to say again, thank you for attending today's session. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you had any issues or questions, my contact details, George's contact details are on that slide there. And please let us know from any questions or comments, particularly if there's connectivity problems and the like. After this, we're going to send around a very short survey. Please do take the time to fill it in so we can improve the sessions and have greater engagement. For those of you who attended the Nuclear Security Culture Programme workshops, we really do want to keep in touch and see how you're doing. So as a reminder, if you attended a course in the UK since 2018, please do look out for the impact survey emails, which we send around periodically. We really do pay attention to them and we really do value your feedback. So please do take the time to try and complete those surveys. In the meantime, thank you again for attending. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which will be on the 25th of June, Nuclear Security During Transport by Ben Rickard from INS. In the meantime, thank you very much for attending and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.